Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see all of you here and to have such good energy. It's my pleasure to introduce the 14th annual Kenyon Bissell Grogan Humanities Symposium this morning at Bremer. As members of the Bremer May community, we have had the privilege of benefiting from this symposium, which comes to us as the result of an endowed chair in the humanities in honor of Kenyon Bissell Grogan, graduate of Bremer May class of 1976. Members of the Board of Trustees and Mrs. Grogan's family and friends endowed the humanities chair in honor of Mrs. Grogan's work and dedication to our school. First as the president of our Alumni Association, and subsequently as a longstanding member of the Board of Trustees, one that spans more than 30 years. She only looks like it's happening for 10, and during which she served as our board chair for 10 of those years, or over a decade. 11? Yeah, over a decade. Today, Mrs. Grogan serves as the chairperson of Bremer May's Development Committee, the dedicated group of trustees, administrators, and parents who raise funds for endowment for financial aid and faculty salaries, the annual fund, and capital improvements such as the Hastings Center that we've been enjoying this year. I'd like now to ask Mrs. Grogan if she'd come forward to be recognized so that you can meet her and recognize her for all that she's done for our school. Mrs. Grogan has a lifelong interest in learning and a deep commitment to the quality of Bremer May education. And this symposium today provides us with something that she values deeply, an opportunity for all of us to learn about something new and to exchange ideas with one another. The topic of this year's symposium is the power and impact of teams. Today you will hear from people who have been working in fields and professions that require teamwork. You will hear from people who rely on the expertise, creativity, and strength of others to get their job done. You will learn how, when people work together effectively, they can accomplish more than they can do on their own. As you know from working collaboratively on academic projects here at school, building an effective team often determines the outcome. Learning how to be a team player happens in several arenas, including the classroom, the stage, on the fields, and on the courts. The topics you will learn about today are designed to make you think critically about the idea of teamwork and how you can be an effective team member. As a school that focuses on fostering active learning and that challenges students to think and work independently and collaboratively, become confident problem solvers, and be critical thinkers, I hope you will find today inspiring and engaging. I'd like to take a moment to thank Mrs. Smith, our Director of Development, for her organizational leadership of this program, to all members of the symposium's committee, and to the symposium's co-chairs, Mrs. Dolan and Miss Smith. Where's Kenley? Miss Smith, Miss Dolan, and Mrs. Smith. Would you stand so we can acknowledge you? Thank you. I appreciate the creativity they brought to putting today's program together. I would like now to ask Mr. Nodell to come to the stage and introduce our keynote speaker. Have a wonderful day.
Almost sounded like the Jaws theme there for a second. So I first met Dr. Raj Punjabi almost 2 years ago at Newton Pre-K Soccer. We didn't get too many chances to speak that first season as I was on the field coaching or herding the children, while Raj had denied me on several occasions to step on the field and work with me as an assistant coach. But his path to the soccer field that day with his wife, Amisha, and his 2 children then, and now 3 children, was one that contained more twists and turns than you could possibly imagine. However, that path has led to a health equity and social justice organization that is changing the landscape of healthcare across the globe. Dr. Raj Punjabi is a co-founder and CEO of Last Mile Health and an associate physician in the Division of Global Health Equity at the Harvard School of Medicine. As I do not want to take away from the talk he has planned, I'll only share a few of the accolades that Raj has received over the past few years. In 2013, he received the Global Citizens Movement Award. In 2017, the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship. In 2017, the TED Prize, a $1 million prize awarded to the Last Mile Health. And he's been named one of Time's 100 most influential people and Fortune's World's 50 Greatest Leaders. Despite all of these accolades, I know Raj to be one of the most humble people I've ever met, a person that exemplifies empathy and compassion, and I was so grateful that he accepted our invitation to speak here today. I'd now like to invite Raj Punjabi up to speak.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? It's so exciting to be here. Thank you, Josh, and thank you so much to the whole school. High school is such an incredibly dynamic time. I was reminded of this recently when I was over. So I spent the second half of my childhood in North Carolina. I was down in High Point, North Carolina over the holiday. My wife and my 3 kids joined me. My dad, who's a videographer, had just cleared out my old room that I used to stay in at the home in high school. And he used to have a studio in there after I left the house. And in the shelf, dusted all up, I found my high school yearbook. How many here have been part of the yearbook, either photoed or in the last couple years? Yeah, all right, good. And so it's still a tradition. And mine, you can imagine, I'm almost 38 now. And I went looking back at my senior high school picture. I had my nice little goofy red, white, green shirt. I had memories of the fact that I was never the most athletic kid in class. I was able to make the cross-country team, but I really, really wanted to play basketball. In fact, my room was still, the LeBron James of our time was a guy named Michael Jordan, and I had posters of Michael Jordan still up in my room in high school. I was reminded that I dated only one person in high school. I went to prom with her, and then I was reminded of this note where I had been turned down after trying to get a date many times and had made a pros and cons list about trying to persuade myself that, in fact, I didn't need her because I was too good for her. Unfortunately, she was sitting right next to me on the bed, turned out to be my wife many, many years later, and she had never seen that pros and cons list. So one of the main messages I have for you is to keep your memorabilia secured from these many years that you have, and be careful about what you open and when. I also remembered that I had never been the most athletic kid in high school, ever, really. I was pretty much a math and science geek. The rest of that story is that we finally did create our own basketball team because I couldn't get into the varsity team, the JV team, so we went down to the local YMCA and created our own team, and for the rules were you had to be under 6 feet tall to play basketball in our league. And I recruited the only team I knew, which was the cross-country team, to be basketball players. The under-6 league, as it was called, required the rims to be lowered to a level that we could dunk on the basketball goals. So we brought them down from the regulation 10-foot down to 8.5 feet, which sounds like a great idea until you realize that everybody else also has their differential lowered, so you cannot actually jump physically over 3 or 4 people. Everybody can dunk, and you are, if you are staffed by the cross-country team, at a significant disadvantage when Most people, we always were able to run up and down the court faster than anyone else, but our season was 0-9, that is 0 wins and 9 losses. And I was reminded in that book of that time. I was never the most athletic kid, as I mentioned. This is me in the 4th grade. I was 9 years old in this picture. This is me actually in my home school in Monrovia in Liberia, West Africa. My parents had migrated to West Africa in the 1970s, and they're both Indian origin. My mother was a math teacher, and my dad was a small merchant. He sold home goods. They migrated there, and it's a beautiful country. How many here have been to Africa, traveled to Africa? Oh, wow. All right, great. So this is on the west coast of Africa, a small country called Liberia. Actually, in Latin means land of the free. It was founded by freed American slaves, African-American slaves in the 1800s, and became and is still the only longest free independent republic in Africa. It was actually founded before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a very inspiring country to live in. And as a kid in the 4th grade, I was into math, science, I was into soccer. I had never heard of basketball. Eventually, I did. But I had a pretty normal childhood until this yearbook picture. Actually, this also happened to be a class picture that year. It was the last time I ever saw any of my classmates. And the reason is that year, there was something that happened. My father always had this saying growing up, and he still says it: no condition is permanent. No condition is permanent. It's something I learned the hard way. That year, a civil war erupted in my home country. The war started in the rural countryside, way out in the rainforest of Liberia. There was a man named Charles Taylor who is now in in London in a jail, but at that time he had escaped a Massachusetts jail. His Liberian origin, had embezzled money, had been investigated and jailed in Massachusetts, somehow escaped the jail, ended up on the other side of the border in Liberia, recruited several hundred people, and they started a civil war because the country had become so unequal. 1% of the country controlled 70% of the country's wealth. The country had ignored education for rural people and indigenous people, the very people who had been living there for generations and centuries, and eventually this led to violence. The war started in the countryside, and within months, the rebel armies had approached my hometown. My mother came knocking one morning and said, "Raj, pack your things, we have to go." We were rushed to the center of an airfield in the middle of town. The rebels had captured the only airport that was flying international flights, and they'd set up this makeshift area where people were being evacuated. My mother, sister, and I were stuck into one line, and we were thrust into the cargo compartment of a rescue plane. We were sitting on a bench, a wooden bench. There was the luggage right in front of us with a big net cast over it. My heart was racing as a 9-year-old, as you can imagine. My dad had been trying to help others get out. I looked out across the open hatch, the hatch through which we had entered the back of the plane. And I saw hundreds of others, people that didn't look like me. My parents had immigrated to Liberia. People who had been native born, had heritage from Liberia. Mothers with children on their backs trying to jump in that plane with us. And because they didn't have the same passport that I had, I was born in Liberia, but I had an Indian passport, they were not able to get on. I watched soldiers restrain them. They were not allowed to flee. We were the lucky ones. We had a chance to eventually get resettled in North Carolina. My dad got out on one of these planes he was helping others leave on. It turned out to be at the persuasion of his friend. It also turned out to be the last plane that would leave the country. We were taken in by a family in High Point, North Carolina for several weeks. My dad had a chance to start a little store called, as you would imagine, in High Point, North Carolina, called New York Styles. My dad had been selling buckets and candles and home goods, so he had to learn a new style of business. And in High Point and then in Winston-Salem, New York Styles had expanded. And I would spend my days as a 10th grader and as 11th grader trying to recruit my fellow classmates to join me in the store on weekends with my dad. He was always trying to build up the workforce during the holidays. And we would sell jeans and sneakers. I will admit I still get dressed from that store. This suit is from there. But I would learn a lot during that time. My dad kept repeating that mantra, no condition is permanent. It's true about the things we take for granted. It's also true about the conditions we think are hopeless. My dad would set up these jingles on radio. How many here are into hip-hop music? All right, good. How many here know Snoop Dogg or Notorious B.I.G.? All right. So I'm dating myself, but I'm not outdated. Good. So we would have my dad's New York Styles jingles, buy one pair of jeans and get 3 free, in between Snoop Dogg and Notorious B.I.G. on the radio. My dad, you can imagine, had to shift quite a bit as an immigrant in this country. His name is Ramesh, Punjabi. Ramesh wasn't that appealing a name on the radio, so as he thought. So he changed his name. His friend's name, who helped him start the store, was also called Ramesh. Ramesh, his friend, had changed his name to Rocky. So my dad, Ramesh, changed his name to Ricky. The Crazy Ricky's Crazy Deals would go on the radio, buy one, get one free. And I learned quite a bit about entrepreneurship in this country, about working in teams, whether it was with my classmates in that store selling jeans and sneakers or with my father as a young man. I also learned about the power of that mantra, no condition is permanent. My dad would repeat that mantra again and again. My mother sought out friends in the local community. Now look, our family is Hindu, but my mother was trying to assimilate me in school, and so she joined the local Baptist church. And the first thing I ever did was to paint a Bible of create a clay Jesus Bible and paint it, which is still sitting next to the Krishna Murthy in my mother's home. I met a woman through that Baptist church. No condition is permanent. The hopeless conditions we face can be solved if we believe we're in this together. If we believe that our journeys are not self-made but shaped by others, shaped by our parents, shaped by our family, shaped by our friends, or shaped by our mentors. And I met a woman at that Baptist church, at the Green Street Baptist Church, named Lisa Black. Now, Lisa Black was an incredible person. She had been abused as a young woman by her own parents, by her father. She had taken that trauma in her life and developed a deep sense of empathy for other young kids who had been marginalized. She had been involved in the Boys and Girls Club in High Point, North Carolina. She'd adopted a young man named Adrian. Now, they came from different backgrounds, different races. Adrian had been kicked out of his family because his father was into drugs and had left the house. His mother was having a hard time handling the family. And he'd go down to a local Boys and Girls Club, and Lisa, who I now call Auntie Lisa, took me down there one day to the Boys and Girls Club to see poverty, to be close to it, to see that what I had come from, what others were facing, was still present even in the communities we live and work in. I understand many of you are involved in community service, right? How many of you have done or planning to do something around community service? Good, that's great. Almost all of you have raised your hands. Those years, I was 14 years old, I was a pretty shy kid. I was trying to find myself. What was I going to do? I had all these pressures that we sometimes face when you're 14 and 15 and 16 and 17 years old. What am I going to do with my life? What do I really care about? How much do I believe in myself? And Auntie Lisa would sit me down after those meetings at the Boys and Girls Club, where we'd hang out with the kids like Adrian and others, and ask me what I thought about it. Eventually, she mentored me across those many months. And she said these 4 words to me that I never will forget. I believe in you. If we want to shift the conditions we face, no matter how hopeless they seem, we have to start with the belief that we're all in this together. We have to start with the belief that our journeys are not self-made, they are made by, shaped by others. People like our parents, people like our friends, people like our mentors. Now, it had been 15 years since I had escaped the airfield, but the memory of that day had not escaped my mind. You can be 9 years old and not understand why there's a problem in the world, but you can feel that problem. You can understand when something is wrong, can't you? You can be young and you can still understand when there is an injustice. The memory of that day had not escaped my mind. I was 24 years old. I had been involved in community service in high school. I had taken that through college at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. To every summer, I tried to get involved in a community service project. And by the time I was 24, we finally had our green card. I had a chance to go back to Liberia. I wanted to go back because I wanted to see if we could serve the people we'd left behind. And when I got home, what I found was just utter destruction. And my school had been destroyed, my primary school. The lights in the capital city, Monrovia, had been demolished. There were no traffic lights. There were no normal lights. There was no running water. But worst of all was the human loss. We had lost about 250,000 of our people, a country of only 5 million. Everyone had been affected by this conflict. But we were also left, I was a medical student, I was interested in healthcare. We were also left with just 51 doctors to serve a country of 5 million people. To put that in perspective, imagine the entire city of Boston having just 8 doctors to care for everyone with a sore throat, to care for everyone with a heart attack, to care for everyone who is trying to give birth. That's a tough thing to do. So when I got involved in the healthcare system as a volunteer, I was put into remote rural areas. Now, if you got sick in the city where those few doctors remained after the war, you might stand a chance. But if you're in remote rural areas, you might be hours to days away from the nearest clinic. And I was seeing my patients die from conditions really no one should die from in the 21st century, from complications of childbirth, from simple things like a strep throat gone wrong, a pneumonia, a lung infection, a broken limb that got infected because there was no treatment. Imagine for a moment you have a sore throat. And how many of you have had a sore throat in the last 4 years? Don't tell me what you have now. Just tell me what you had in the last 4 years. Yeah. So imagine everyone's heard of strep throat. It turns out strep throat is very painful, as you know. And often you need antibiotics for it. And if you don't get antibiotics, some bad things can happen. You could get a heart condition. Disease can spread through your blood system, the bacteria can lodge into your heart, and your heart can valves can get damaged. Imagine for a moment you had a strep throat. You woke up one morning with a strep throat. Imagine for a moment that you live not near a clinic around the corner, but to get care you had to jump in a canoe near the river, get to the other side, and then walk for hours, if not up to 2 days, just to reach the nearest doctor. Well, this, my friends, is not an anecdote. It is not the example for just one person on earth. It turns out we've made some amazing advances in medicine. Actually, this city, my medical school, has contributed to those advances. We've made antibiotics and vaccines and surgery and care for cancer. But these innovations are not reaching everyone, I was learning. It turned out that my country, Liberia, wasn't the only one facing this challenge. It turned out that 1 billion people on this earth, about 1/7 of the planet, go their entire lives without seeing a professional health worker. They live without access to these areas. We call these areas last mile communities. And what I was realizing is that illness is universal, healthcare is not. And this lit a fire in my soul. No one should die because they live too far from a doctor. No condition should be permanent. in response to this, we realized that the answer, and this is probably the second lesson, we're all in this together. Where are our teams? Where did they come from? Well, the team in this case did not come from the outside. It came from within. Meet Musu. Musu was 48 when I met her. She had actually managed to graduate high school in Liberia, in rural Liberia. That's a very tough thing to do. Only 25% of girls even make it past primary school, either because they're pulled out because their parents don't want them in there, or because they don't have access to schools themselves. Musu had made it all the way through. Her uncle had helped her get through, but she stopped at the age of 18 and she went 30 years without a job. Now, when she came back to her community in rural Liberia, what she found were that kids were dying from diseases that really no one should die from. Malaria that could be treated, pneumonia that could be treated. Mothers were not delivering babies on the dirt floor of their huts, not in the safety of clinics. She wanted to do something about it, so she became a volunteer. Now we got to thinking, what if the medical team could involve someone like Musu? Most of medical care, how many here have seen a doctor or nurse? Yeah, so you know doctors and nurses, right? So that's how most medical teams are made of. And we got to thinking, well, what if that could change? What if we could reorganize the medical care system? What if Musu, people like her, community members, could be a part or even the center of our medical team? What if we could actually train, equip, and hire her to bring healthcare from cities to the doorsteps of her neighbors? And so that's what we did. We tried to invest in Musu. Investing in the people closest to the problems we want to solve, making them part of our teams, is absolutely vital to our goals of public service, of health equity, of social justice. So we invested in her. We hired her. We trained her in a few months. What a doctor could do in 4 years, we carved that out. Instead of 4,000 things, she would be doing 30 things. Turned out the training was a lot shorter for that. A nurse trained her to do the basic medical care on the top 10 diseases, how to prevent, diagnose, and treat, how to refer when she needed to, within 6 months. She was equipped with the normal things like stethoscopes, but thankfully we live in the digital age and we will continue to. We equipped her with a smartphone that gave her videos on how to identify a child with malnutrition, how to help a mother, and the importance of breastfeeding, for instance. And we paid her. We invested in her. The single most important thing we can do in healthcare and education, et cetera, is to be able to enable people to have jobs in rural areas or in marginalized communities. And so we invested in Musu to be a community health worker, as we called it. Now, she's amazing. She's done 30 medical skills, from screening kids for malnutrition to diagnosing the cause of a child's fever or cough with a smartphone. She's supported women with HIV and AIDS. And she's also helped ensure that those who've lost their limbs get the care that they need after surgery. Community health workers working as part of our teams with doctors and nurses can help ensure that the kind of care your family doctor might provide reaches the places family doctors would never go. And for the things that are more complicated, ensure that patients from those areas get to the hospitals where they could get care. Now, one of my favorite things to do as a doctor is to care for community patients with these community health workers. So let me tell you about AB, who I was with a couple years ago. AB was in the 8th grade, living in a rural village, a fishing village off the Sestos River in Liberia in the rainforest. AB had been in the 8th grade when he had to drop out. His parents had died from illnesses, and he had to stop school. A couple years ago, we met and hired and trained AB as a community health worker. One day, AB was going door to door looking for children and family members who were sick, and he found a little boy named Prince. Now, Prince was starving, as you can tell. His mother lived in a 10-foot room in a mud hut with a thatched roof. His mother was 15 years old when she gave birth. She was illiterate. She was worried. She loved her son, but she didn't know what to do. So AB, realizing, had just been trained in using this simple measuring tape that wraps around the upper arm of a child, and realized that Prince was in the red zone, which meant that Prince had to get more care than was available in his community. So Prince put him in a canoe, paddled that canoe 4 hours upriver, got him to a hospital. Prince was hospitalized for a couple of weeks, given the care that he needed. When he came home, AB was the one who helped ensure that mother knew how to feed Prince a food supplement, a nutritious peanut butter-like paste. Well, a few months later, AB took me on a visit. We went up that river, we got off, we walked for an hour through the forest, and we got to AB's home, and he, at that time, was pretty chubby. A year old, was pulling himself up to a stand and mouthing a few words, which is what you should have at 12 months. That's my child. My daughter is 12 months old, and that's what she's starting to do. She's not as chubby as Prince, but when you ask the people you work with why they do what they do, as I asked AB, here's what they sometimes say. We get inspired by that, don't we? He said to me, Doc, that's the short form of doctor in Liberia, Doc, since I've been in the 8th grade, I haven't had a chance to use a pen to write. My brain is getting fresh. That's our words in Liberia for I'm learning, I'm advancing myself. That's what we're all here to do, aren't we? Well, I have been so moved by the power of serving others that AB and others show, the idea that we're all in this together, that if we serve our neighbors, if we serve our communities, if we bring the best in our talents, if we believe our journeys are not self-made but shaped by others, if we believe that no condition is permanent. I was so moved by all of this, especially a couple years ago, right across about the border from where AB lives, in a community called Meliandu, in the same rainforest, a little boy named Emil would fall sick with vomiting, fever, and diarrhea in December 2013. He would end up dying from this condition. A few weeks later, his mother and his grandmother and his sister, who all cared for him, ended up dying from the same symptoms and the same disease. And this disease was spread from one community to another. He lived in the dense rainforest, but where the roads are sparse and the health workers are short. There's not enough of them. And this disease would spread from one community to another until 3 months later, when it was identified as the Ebola epidemic. By then, every minute had counted. Already lost months. The disease spread like wildfire across my country and the ones near it. We were told at the height of the crisis there could be as many as 1.4 million people infected. And at the same time, there were then candidates and other that we should stop everyone that's going there from coming back to America. The airlines were freaking out. They had cut down most of the flights to the country. Businesses, big multinational corporations that had massive iron ore mines and plantations, were pulling their staff out. So you can imagine myself and a number of others who had started a nonprofit organization called Last Mile Health with $6,000 from our wedding, my wife and I's. It's the most romantic thing I've ever done in my life. We asked for donations from our relatives to invest in creating Last Mile Health with the mission of bringing healthcare within reach of everyone everywhere. And we'd hired people like Musu and AB to be the co-founders of that organization. So you can imagine sitting there in the middle of the forest, seeing the airlines shut down, the companies stop, government saying they're going to cut off Liberia like a wounded, infected limb, and asking yourself, what should I do? I remember standing in the forest training a number of midwives and nurses and community health workers to don the masks, the gloves, the gowns they needed to keep themselves safe to go door to door to find patients who were sick with Ebola. This transmits person to person, as you remember, and can really get you sick. About 60% of people will die if they don't get the treatment that they need, the care that they need. You can imagine feeling like you don't have all the answers, and we didn't. But in that moment when Ebola threatened to bring humanity to its knees, Liberia's community health workers, the people we worked with, and many, many others, did not surrender to fear. They believed that we're all in this together, and they did what they'd always done. They answered the call to serve their neighbors. They learned the signs of symptoms of Ebola. They went door to door with doctors and nurses to find the sick, to get them into care, to break the chain of transmission and literally help hunt the virus and stop it in its tracks. Some 10,000 community members in Liberia and in the countries near them helped bring the epidemic to a halt. And they kept all of us much safer because they did that. You'll remember in September 2014, there was actually a case in Dallas, Texas. We learned a few things from the Ebola epidemic. We learned that rural communities like Emil's need to have healthcare from the beginning. That's our best emergency system, is an everyday healthcare system that reaches all people. But we also learned from the courage and power of Liberia's community health workers that we as people are not defined by the conditions we face, no matter how hopeless they seem. We're defined by how we respond to them. So if we believe we're all in this together, and I've seen this idea of working together with communities in healthcare as community health workers play out everywhere from the forest communities of West Africa to the fishing villages of Alaska. I've seen it play out in the rivers of the Amazon and in the mountains of Central Asia. The future of change means that we invest in people closest to the problem that we work with. We believe that we're all in this together. We believe that no condition is permanent. And so I'll invite all of you to get involved in this fight, now or later, if you're interested in public health. If you go to communityhealthacademy.org, you will find a set of courses that are coming online to teach anyone who wants to build programs like these, to hire, train, and equip local people to provide health care, to do that work. I would invite you to share that. The courses, they're free and available elsewhere. The first one will be co-produced with Harvard University. And the first one launches in April. We'll also be providing videos for any local person anywhere in the world that wants to learn how to take on the top things that kill people, to how to diagnose and treat pneumonia and malaria. That will be provided on smartphones and freely available. So we're excited about this. And I will close with this last story. I think a lot about that story from my father, that mantra, no condition is permanent. As Josh mentioned, I'm also a dad. Around the time my wife was was pregnant with our third child, I was caring for a woman in the forests of Liberia who, like my wife, was also in her third pregnancy. Now, the difference is that this woman that I was caring for in the forest had had no prenatal care with her first two babies. She had gone and she had been living in a village that had gone 100 years without any health care. Until a couple years ago, a local nurse trained her neighbors to be community health workers. And here I was caring for this young woman. She was about 32 weeks pregnant. And we had the ultrasound, you know, that image that they put on the belly to see what the baby looks like inside. And she was telling me a few stories about her kids and how they were annoying her and how she was also hoping for great things for them. And she heard, and she turned to me and she said, "Doc, what's that sound?" It was the first time this woman had ever heard her baby's heartbeat. And her eyes lit up in the same way my wife's eyes and my own eyes lit up when we heard our baby's heartbeat. Probably in the same way your parents lit up when they heard your heartbeats. Illness is universal. Access to healthcare is not. And I think it's time, working all together, for us to change this condition. No condition is permanent. It's something my father said. It's something I believe. And I think we can get it done. Thank you.
So we're going to have a few questions. Raj and I are just going to sit down. I have some questions, but also if you have questions, just raise your hand and